Strategy Execution Unlocked and the 6th episode in our OGs of Strategy Execution series. In this series, I sit down with the pioneers who have helped shape the strategy execution space. That's industry analysts, authors, founders of management consultancies and software companies, and of course, the seasoned industry practitioners. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Stuart Easton to the show. Stuart is the CEO and founder of TransparentChoice, where he's developed a platform that helps portfolio leaders analyze and select initiatives that truly align with their business strategy to maximize business outcomes. He's also a guest lecturer on project prioritization at the University of Oxford. Stuart, thanks for joining me today.
Great to see you, Ben. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you. So I've been really looking forward to this conversation because misalignment of both operational and discretionary activities and spend with business strategy may be one of the biggest obstacles I think organizations need to overcome. And that's exactly the area that you've been focused on for many years. So, maybe let's start at the beginning. Now, what does strategy execution mean to you, and what inspired you to found TransparentChoice?
Gosh, what a big question. So let's start with the second of those first, right? So why? Because I think it'll answer the first one. So why did we start TransparentChoice? Well, through my career, I've done the fairly traditional thing, right? You start as an individual contributor, and you become a manager, and a more senior manager, and so on. And the more senior I became, the more organized. I've been very lucky. I've worked on, done business on 6 continents and a number of different industries and all that kind of good thing. And the thing that I just saw again and again and again and again was that organizations really struggle to execute their strategy. No surprise, that's why we're all here. But fundamentally, the reason is that, when you go right back to the root cause, the reason is almost always about alignment. Okay, so if we're not able to execute well, it's often, people will say, "Oh, well, it's because we don't have enough resources." Really? Or is it because you have too little focus on what's important, right? And therefore you're doing a lot of stuff you shouldn't be doing, and that's sucking the energy from the things you should be doing, right? And so, I'm not that smart, right? But even I spot a pattern when you see it again and again and again and again. And so we decided, 3 guys sitting around a Starbucks table, that we would try and solve this problem. And, one of my co-founders used to teach decision science at the Technical University of Poznan, which is like Poland's MIT. And the question I had for him was, look, senior leaders, they're really smart people. You give them good data, but they still struggle to make the decisions that they need to make to really drive the strategy. Why is that? And fundamentally, it comes down to 2 or 3 things. It comes down to a lack of alignment of the people, right? Before you get the people around the leadership table, before you get to the rest of the organization, right? A lack of alignment amongst the people. It comes down to the way you make decisions matters, right? Particularly at this high stakes level of strategic planning, and what investments are we making? That's highly politicized, right? So the way you make the decisions matters, because if you don't make it in a way that works, then people aren't going to buy in. And so ultimately, to me, strategy execution is about, first of all, aligning on what we actually mean by strategy. Right? What is our strategy? Translating that into a framework that you can use to actually drive decision making. Okay, and that's slightly different to a framework that you need for measuring performance, which is also important. That's an important part of strategy execution. But that's the back end. That's when you've implemented stuff. You want to know, is it working, right? So first of all, you need that framework for strategy making, decision making, excuse me, that maps to your strategy. And we looked around, and we just didn't see anything that did that. So that's what we founded TransparentChoice to do, was to really try and drive that process. So, over the last little more than a decade, we've been building, learning, and engaging with organizations, typically medium, large corporates, large government departments, things like that, so that we've now had, we've got the theoretical side along with the School of Hard Knocks, and we've learned a thing or two about how to make it really work, which is, it's been a fun journey. But fundamentally, what is strategy execution? It's getting people aligned and agreeing what our strategy is, and then aligning your investments and your activities to deliver that strategy, and then just making sure that you're measuring it all to make sure that you've actually delivered it. Now, of course, there's a load of complexity in there. I suspect we're going to touch on some of that over the next few minutes.
Yeah, to me, strategy execution, and I like your definition, but to me, it is 10 miles wide, 2-inch deep, right? Because I always describe it as the nexus of many different functions and key processes. So strategic portfolio management, which includes all that alignment stuff we were just talking about, the intersect with that, and business architecture and enterprise architecture in terms of evolving your operating model relative to the strategy, and of course project execution and change management. So those are independent disciplines, often led by different functions, but they need to come together. But as I said in the intro, I kind of feel it all starts and ends with the executive team, because of the need to get strategy clearly defined and communicated across the organization to support decision making, right? And the other, bookend there of measuring the results. And there's a lot of stuff in between.
Absolutely.
But I feel a little bit like the area that you're focused on is one of the Achilles heels, right? Because
I'd suggest, Ben, that it's probably right. There are lots of levers that you've got in the business that you can push and pull. But I think that strategic alignment is probably the biggest lever that any organization has to control where they go and how fast they get there. So one example is, McKinsey did a study and wrote it's a pretty famous, I think it was an HBR article, something like "Put your money where your strategy is" was the name of it, something like that. And basically they looked at a whole bunch of big companies, and they looked at how well they align their investments with the really top level strategic goals. So the what business are we in level of strategy, not even the what should we do within the business, but just at the what business are we in level of strategy, right? Which is just one aspect of strategic alignment. And, most organizations, empirically what they saw is that most organizations just kind of roll their investments forward year to year. We're in these businesses, and so we're just, we put that much investment in there last year, that's what we'll do again this year, right? That's what most organizations do. But a small number of organizations deliberately think about what are our goals and where should we invest to maximize the return on those goals. So just making that decision at that level led to the companies that did that are worth 40% more, 40, not 40% more than those that don't. Now, of course, that value doesn't appear instantly. It accrues. It's cumulative, right? So it takes 10 years for that difference to emerge. But just change that one key process. That's just one process that can drive an additional 40% of value to your business. Now, I'm not aware of very many processes in organizations that have that kind of power, right? And that's what we're talking about, right? That's why this is so important.
Yeah, it's almost like without that, you're starting a journey on a 2-degree wrong course, so you're going to end up somewhere where you don't want to be. What's amazed me a little bit is, and certainly as I start to look at research in this space, is there aren't too many metrics like you just mentioned, right? They're going back to that McKinsey study that actually highlight the implications of poor misalignment. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that translates into poor execution, like failure rates in projects is significantly increased by if the works or the projects are misaligned in the first place. But I was surprised actually how few metrics there are out there, or at least recent metrics, around the percentage of misaligned projects within a standard portfolio. Because I think it's almost a silent killer or an invisible killer of the portfolio from the get-go, right?
Absolutely. So the PMI did some research back in 2017, so that's quite old now. And they found that something like 20% of projects in a typical portfolio are so badly aligned with the goals of the organization they should be stopped, right? So that, to me, that's a fantastic definition of waste, but it's worse than that, right? It's worse than waste. because a good number of those projects are actually taking you in the wrong direction, right? So imagine, the 1 in 5. So let's say you're standing at one end of a football field, right? And you're trying to get to the other end of the football field. And so, your steps aren't perfectly aligned, right? Your projects aren't perfectly aligned. So, you roll a dice. And if you get a 0, you stay where get 1, you stay where you are. 2, you take a step forward. 3, you take a step to the right. 4, a step to the left. 5 will go diagonally forward, and then 6 will go backwards a step. Okay, so you roll the dice, and slowly you make your way down the field, right? And there's 2 of you doing this. You're rolling the dice. The difference between the 2 people is one guy, every time he rolls the 6, he takes the step backwards. The other guy doesn't take the step backwards. Imagine how much quicker he gets to the end of the field, right? It's not a little bit quicker, it's a lot quicker because he's not taking steps backwards. And so this is what's happening in an organization. 20% of your portfolio is pointing backwards. So you don't need to spend more money to accelerate. You just need to stop going backwards, right? It's not just about waste. It's so much more than that. It's about it's about aligning your energy. It's about focus. It's about motivation. It's all those things. But fundamentally, if you just stop going backwards, you're going to go forwards a lot quicker.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned 2 things. One, there's the sort of natural communication of strategy and definition of strategy. And then there's the frameworks in terms of making better decisions around strategy, right? If we break those 2 things down, right, I've often said that executive team cannot complain about misalignment unless they are taking the ownership of ensuring that strategy is clearly defined and communicated across the organization. So that's not just enterprise or corporate strategy, that is making sure that's translated and decomposed into strategies that support that corporate strategy based on the different functions within the business. I still think organizations are horribly bad at this, right? And are not providing their employees or teams with that North Star, right, before they even start to think about what projects they're working on. Why do you think that is still the case today?
That's a really big question. So I'm going to start with something a little smaller, if that's okay. So imagine a decision that you and your other half made recently, right? Something fairly big, something quite important, and something that you argued about, right? You didn't agree on it, right? Maybe it was buying a car or a sofa or a new house or something, right? And emotions can get high, and you can say some things that you don't really mean, and you find yourself arguing about this thing, right? Let's say it's a house. I love this house. It's the best house. No, I think this house over here is better. Well, I like this house because it's close to the schools and the shops. Yeah, but this house, it's got a beautiful front yard, and the neighborhood's really nice, right? Yeah, but this one's really convenient, and it'll give us loads of time because we can walk to school, right, to drop the kids off. Right, notice what's happening. We're arguing about houses, but we're not actually arguing about the houses. We're arguing about what we're trying to optimize for in the decision, right? I'm trying to optimize for easy life, proximity to school, the shops, and everything else so that life is easy. My wife, she's optimizing for a nice neighborhood. So you got great, we can go to parties with nice people and interesting people and all that kind of stuff, right? So the problem isn't that we're arguing over the house. The problem is we haven't agreed on what's important to us, what our goals are in life, right? So that's the starting point for all of this, is actually in the boardroom, getting real agreement on what are our goals and what are the trade-offs between those goals that we need to make. Is it more important to us to grow revenue or to hit our ESG goals? Is it more important for us to, in times of uncertainty, to protect our employees or to maximize market share? Right? If we don't agree on those things, then we're going to drive the decision making in different directions as you cascade down the organization. So what that means is, as you start to, you go from top level corporate strategy down to divisional strategy and departmental strategy and so on, right? As you're cascading down, that problem just gets bigger and bigger. And so you can offset some of that through clear communication. But if at the very top of the organization, you don't have real strong agreement on what the goals and trade-offs need to be, then when you're cascading, you're going to be cascading different messages. And so what you end up with is you end up with stovepipes. It's quite normal. You at some level, you have to stovepipe large organizations, right? You can't not do that. And some people try and matrix it to get over the stovepipe, but then you have stovepipes and then you have drain pipes going across, and it's that can be even worse, right? So whatever you do, you're going to end up with some kind of stovepiping. And if the leadership leading those stovepipes don't have the same vision, then you're going to have different visions down those stovepipes, and then you've got politics and you've got everything else. So before you start cascading the strategy, you need to spend time to make sure that you really clearly understand what are the goals and what are the trade-offs between those goals. If we're going to make those, if we've got to make trade-offs between revenue and ESG or something, how should we be thinking about those decisions? And you've had some experience doing that as well, Ben, I know. And it's absolutely transformative for leadership teams when they do this properly, right? When they have these conversations. We worked with a large financial services company, and they'd spent 2 years with one of the big four companies trying to create this sort of high-level strategic, the big strategic planning process, and trying to get agreement on how do we translate that into action, and fundamentally failed. So then they engaged us, and we went through this process, and this sort of decision science driven process. And suddenly they're sitting there going, "Oh, now we're aligned. We haven't had this kind of conversation before. That's interesting." And so once the people are aligned, it's much easier to align the investments, right? So going back to the husband-wife situation, if we agree that actually it's more important that our kids get a good education than it is that we enjoy the tennis club lifestyle, then okay, now we can evaluate the different houses against those goals, and we can agree which house is the best one that we should buy. Right? It's the same process within a family, within your personal life, as you at some level as you would apply in a corporation. It's just much more complex in that corporate environment.
Yeah, which is going to bring in the elephant in the room, which is often the human dimension here, right, and the politics that comes into this decision making. And again, difficult to separate how to establish that framework and the decision support from one another, right? Because of what we can talk maybe a little bit about some of the decision support science or tools that you have, and as you mentioned. Back in the day, I created a similar product that you have now, probably too far ahead of its time, right? It's
probably was
now mainstream today, right? But I often found that conducting those goal settings, or what we used to call business driver definition sessions back there, and identifying the divergence of opinion in the room on the relative priorities of these business drivers or goals, right?
Yeah.
Was eye-opening, right? You could go and meet each individual exec, right, and have that prioritization discussion around the importance of each strategy to one another, each business driver to one another, get their opinion, and then kind of mesh that up individually to see where you have that divergence of opinion within the executive team, and then focus the next kind of workshop on exactly that divergence by saying, for the upcoming planning period, right, what is more important, this, and why for you is this important? Or is that importance driven by function in the organization? I'm VP of sales versus ops or whatever, right?
Absolutely.
Eye-opening, right? And as you say, if you don't have that clear definition at the enterprise level with the relative prioritization of the strategy, before we even get into the underlying investments, right? As you decompose across the organization, the problem gets compounded further, right? And the misalignment just inherently builds.
Absolutely. Well, it's really interesting. Not everybody knows that there is a field of research called decision science, right? But there is, and it's really cool. It's really fascinating. It's usually hidden away in a psychology department or operation research department or an engineering department of university. And the guy who probably did more to kickstart that field than any other is a guy called Dan Kahneman. You may have read a book of his, Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, or is it Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow? One of those two, which is all about kind of how people make decisions, really. You know, how we think we make decisions and how we really make decisions. And his most recent book is called Noise, right, which actually is just right there up on my shelf. And I've got a whole bunch of books like that up on that shelf, by the way. And here's the really interesting thing, right? So humans, we're not great decision makers. We think we are. We have these wonderful heuristics that we learn over time. So where humans are really good decision makers is where you have repeat decisions and where you get immediate feedback, right? So this is why firefighters, soldiers, the police train, right? Because what they're doing is they are training their intuition so that when they're under pressure and they need to make a decision in a split second, they can do that because they've lived through 100 similar situations and their brain's done the pattern matching, created the heuristics, and they can make the decision. But guess what? When you're making big decisions in business, you don't do that, right? You don't make hundreds of those big decisions a year, right? You're doing it once or twice a year. And your feedback, which is really important for building that heuristic, that feedback is delayed 3 years, right? You don't know if you made the right decision for 3 years. So there's no feedback loop. So that sort of intuitive decision-making tends not to work. So another book up there is by a guy called Professor Paul Nutt. And Paul's big thing is he looked at thousands of decisions across large enterprises, and half of those decisions ended in failure. Not particularly because of execution, but because the decision-making process didn't work. So if you read both of those books and various others, what you'll find is that good decision-making at this enterprise level, right? We're talking about this kind of enterprise decision-making, which strategic planning and alignment is a part of. It starts with this understanding of what are we trying to achieve, framing the problem, right? What are our business goals, and what are how are we going to make trade-offs between them? And the way that you normally think about that in decision making is criteria, right? You say, what criteria are we going to use to make this decision? And when you do that, and you do that well, right? The problem is that different people, as we've already said, they're going to weight those criteria differently. And this is where it's not really our software. It's this process that your software, Ben, that you had all those years ago, and our software use. And it's called AHP, Analytic Hierarchy Process. And we don't promote it, right? We don't promote AHP because it's in our software. We built it into our software because that's what the research tells us works, right? And it was the same for you guys, I suspect, when you started up. Right. So what AHP does is it really focuses on that first bit. Let's have a discussion about what those goals are, what those criteria are. And as you said, it gets you to really think deeply about comparing your criteria. Is it more important to grow revenue or to hit our ESG goals, carbon emissions and things like that? Okay. And do you know what? If you're the compliance officer in an energy company, and you know that you're looking at the wrong end of $1 billion worth of fines if you don't hit your ESG goals, you're going to think the ESG thing is all that matters. But if you're the sales guy, right, who's responsible for growing revenue, you don't care about that. You only think about revenue. So as an enterprise, we need to have a conversation about that. It's not okay for two senior leaders to think that they are the most important thing and that thing over there doesn't matter. right? That's not okay. It's just not, right? It leads to confusion, misalignment, politics. So much energy and time is wasted on politics. It's untrue. So it's all about humans. It's all about the way that people make decisions, and how do you build that understanding and bust biases, right? Best way to bust biases is to get diverse people around a table and have a structured conversation, not just a conversation, but a structured conversation, right? And that comes out in both the books I mentioned earlier, right? If you have a structured conversation about what are we trying to achieve first, then collect the data about your alternatives, in this case, projects, investments, initiatives, strategic initiatives, things like that, right? And evaluate them against these goals that we've created. Then you've got data that can drive your decision. But never make the mistake of thinking that, the data that you're collecting is real, right? You're building a model of reality. We're estimating, if you've got an initiative to launch a new product or enter a new market, right? One of your variables will be how much revenue will it drive? And so someone will spend a month and build this amazing spreadsheet that's got inputs about how many customers will win and how much each one will spend and how many years they'll remain with us before they churn and all of this kind of good stuff, right? And you'll get a number, $3 billion over 2 years. Okay, 3 billion, we'll put that into the model. Fantastic. Okay, what if you'd had different assumptions? What if someone else had filled in that spreadsheet? Would you have got the same number? Probably not. Right. So again, there are tricks and techniques that you can use, not just to, because your question was about people, right? So people all around these big decisions are putting information in. It's not just the senior leaders, right? There are people around the organization who are those subject matter experts who are putting data in. And we sometimes, and if you don't have good processes for cleaning that data, for minimizing the noise and the randomness, right? You can have the best executives sitting in the corner office and still get really bad decisions because the people that are putting data into the system are just naturally noisy, random noise generators. And one quick thing, Ben, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. So, one of the things that people say is, oh, but AI will fix that. No, AI can certainly help with some of that noise in some cases. But the whole point of these strategic goals and setting strategy is that it is a subjective process. It's not an objective. There isn't an objectively correct answer to strategic questions. It is inherently subjective. It depends on how we value those goals. It depends on what level of confidence we have in our ability to grow our sales. It depends on how we assess and estimate the effectiveness of our competitors and how they're going to respond to our moves in the market. All of that is subjective. AI cannot answer those questions. So this is absolutely a people process. It's not an AI has place in it, but this is absolutely inherently a people process.
I totally agree. I mean, I think AI is going to have an impact on most things. Exactly what that's going to be is the open question. I had another guest on the OGs that said that may have more impact on the sort of execution of a portfolio than actually the planning or the strategic planning of a portfolio. So yeah, we'll wait and see. I had a funny story. I had a customer years and years ago that this is before we even heard of AI, say to me, well, if I give you my strategy, can your software tell me which projects to do, right? It doesn't work like that, right? You can't just magically create the optimal list of projects based on whatever strategy you've dreamed up, right? But
wow, what a great point. So I had a conversation just last week with a PMO in a small mid-sized financial services company, and the execs had done exactly that. They said, look, we've written a strategy paper, which was classic. So one of the things about strategy is when you write down your mission and vision and all that kind of good stuff, it's deliberately vague, right? Because it has to cover so much ground, and there's something in there for everyone, at some level. So everybody can read their own thing into it, right? Their own direction into the mission, vision and mission statements. So they said, here's our vision and mission. What project should we do? And the response is, well, no, you've got to engage in that process, right? That's got to be a discussion that we have. It's, you need to have a proper framework to make that decision. It's like, and they're like, oh, no, we don't want to do any work. We don't want to do any work, right? We just want the magic to happen and give us an answer. Okay, fire those executives today. Fire them because they are not doing their job. As an executive, your job is to set the direction, right? To prioritize and allocate resources, and then to do all the governance-y stuff to make sure it happens, right? I know I'm oversimplifying. Of course I am, right? But fundamentally, that's what the job of a senior leader boils down to.
Yeah. No,
and what do you think? Is that a fair comment?
I think it is. I think it is, and it's funny to hear you say that, because I used to also find the opposite of that, right? Where the executives didn't want the objectivity in the decision making, right? Because the results being kicked out by through the decision science was giving them exactly the objectivity based on what they said their goals were and the priorities of their goals, but they still wanted to manage the business with the gut. No, you're taking away my ability to manage a gut, right? Which is really, shining a bright light, which is the biggest challenge in my mind of strategy execution culturally, is that bright light of objectivity, and visibility and transparency in terms of stopping you do inherently what you think you want to do, right?
So I'm pulling faces right now because I'm thinking of a study and I can't remember where I read it. So I'm gonna tell you what the results were because I remember that, but I can't tell you where the study came from. So I apologize. So it was a study into business transformation, and they looked at projects and initiatives as part of business transformation, and where those projects and initiatives originated, from the leadership team or from middle management, and what was the success of those projects and initiatives. Okay. And what they found was that in many organizations, 80% of the projects and initiatives came from senior leadership's gut. Okay. I think this is what we should do. 20% came from the middle management, who were saying, actually, this is broken and this would have a big impact on, you've said that goal is the goal we're trying to achieve. This is what would have a big impact on that, because actually I'm in the business. I see what's happening day to day, right? Look at the outcomes of those projects. 20% of the executive initiative projects succeeded. 80% of the middle management level initiated projects succeeded. This is not saying that executives are idiots. Far from it. But if it won't, by the time you get to that level in an organization, be honest, you don't know how the operations of the organization work anymore. That's not your job. So part of really good decision making is understanding where are the subject matter experts in different bits of that decision. Right. So in strategy execution, right, the executive's job is to make sure we have real clarity. As we said, we use this AHP thing, analytic hierarchy process, to make sure we've got real clarity about how, what the goals are and the relative importance of those goals, because we can then use those to drive decision making. But then it's typically much better to open up the ideation, once you've got that, to then use that information to drive ideation processes. So let's say, the most important thing is we need to grow revenue. The second most important thing is that we've got this new threat emerging out of China. They've got really low products. They used to be rubbish. Now they're actually quite good. And we think in 2 years, they're going to be great, right? So we've got grow revenue, fight China, right? Those are our two goals. So this month, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the organization and say, hey, give us your best ideas. What the opportunity is, what the benefit is, what the cost is, what do you think we really need to do to grow revenue? Just that. And you collect all those ideas. Then you do the same thing the next month with Beat China. And I don't mean to pick on China, right? But that's just an example of what you might do, right? So you then drive an ideation thing about Beat China. So this is great. We're now energizing all the creativity of the organization and of the people in the organization who actually understand, why did we lose that deal last week? Right? The sales guy knows why. He was there. Why was that product late? Right? Or the quality off? Well, the COO doesn't know, but the guy in the factory does. So let's ask them, right? And let's figure out how we can align the activity we're doing to have the biggest impact on our goals. So it really, the strategic planning is not, we had a talk in the green room, right? Is it a top-down process or is it a bottom-up process? Yes, it's both. Yeah. It's both. It should be both.
It's got to be a conversation.
Yeah.
Different vantage points of the organization. No, I mean, it's as I said at the start of this conversation, I think this may be the single biggest obstacle to overcome, right? Because we've got the bookends of setting clear strategy, ensuring we have the right investments and the framework measuring results. The rest of strategy execution, as far as I'm concerned, is the plumbing, which most likely has leaks in where the value is then seeping out, right? In terms of the plan, right? Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth to, quote Tyson, whatever, right? And obviously what we've talked about a lot is setting the strategy and potentially selecting the investments that best align with the strategy from a planning point of view. But then, then reality hits in, right? Then we start doing these things and variables change, right? So it's got to be a continuous motion, not an annual planning motion, right? And I think
absolutely, and it's got to be balancing your change agenda with your just run the business agenda, right? Because you need resources to do both of those things. One of the things that people sometimes think is that BAU is this sort of static engine where stuff just happens, but BAU is changing all the time as well, right? BAU are doing things. Those people who are running that department that's delivering all your revenue, they're also being pulled into change programs, right? So you've got this interdependence between the two. So, you have to be able to sort of cascade down both sides of that. I think of it as a butterfly and it's joined by the body and you've got these two wings, but it's one butterfly, right? And
I think that BAU is a big deal, right? Because, if you look at, I was just looking at some research I did, right? When we talk about strategic planning, it tends to be, a lot of it is on the sort of discretionary activity and spend, right? In terms of the big initiatives you're going to do, right? But obviously, the operating fabric of your business, the business architecture, the enterprise architecture that allows you to effectively run, has to be overhauled to align with the strategy. Of it's just going to be like dragging an anchor, right? And so to me, looking at the alignment of the operational activity and spend, in terms of a dollar number, is significantly more important to a degree than the discretionary activity and spend. And some of the research I've just been doing is looking at, okay, well, if you are able to rationalize that operational spend by ensuring your architecture, both business architecture, enterprise architecture is set to a target state that's going to help you deliver on your strategy, and then ripping out all the legacy stuff in there by capability optimization, business process optimization, technology rationalization, and optimization, right? There's actually a situation which is quite interesting where you can end up robbing Peter to pay Paul. You can either bank that savings or you can take that money and invest it in growth initiatives. And I'm finalizing the research now, but based on standard discretionary budgets, that could give you almost anywhere between, from an average performing organization, 30 to 50% uplift on your discretionary budgets to drive growth, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. No, we see that again and again and again, where, if you can, there will be lots of activities in BAU that actually add very little value, right? Or you could re-engineer them to free up some resource. And if you free up just a little bit of resource, right? Because most of the money is going into operations, it's not going into change and transformation usually, right? So if you can just free up, I don't know, 5%, 10% of operations, budget to do something else by identifying, low value activities and all that kind of good stuff, that might actually double the amount of investment you can make in your transformation programs. Wow, that would really accelerate your business.
Yeah.
So the two, they work hand in glove. And one of the things, actually, just before we leave that strategic alignment thing, so we were saying earlier on that there wasn't a lot of good data about how much investment is wasted. Okay, but there is some good data, and some of it quite recent, from last year and 2022, and some really good papers looking at the impact, the correlation and causation relationship between strategic alignment and profitability. Okay, and so looking across those papers, between 35 and 55% of the variation in profitability between companies is explained by one thing: strategic alignment. Now, that's a huge lever. There's nothing else that I'm aware of that can drive that kind of difference. So think about, if you're going to spend your time on something, if you're going to invest some energy in fixing a process, fix that. Because empirically, it'll drive your profitability more than anything else that you can think of. Most businesses will probably think of something else that'll make a similar contribution. But across all businesses, that lever applies, right? So it should be and companies don't invest enough in it, right? Leaders don't invest enough in this as a process.
Well, that's kind of exactly the point maybe I made earlier, but I certainly made on other shows, where if you think of strategy execution as optimizing business value, right? And there's many points where value is being hemorrhaged or leaked through the plumbing between the strategy definition and the value realization. It blows my mind why organizations are not looking to optimize this and seeing this as a critical process of running their business, right? Because if they had a manufacturing organization had a production line, they're going to optimize the throughput of that production line all day long. So why are we not looking? And I think this, to me, is one of the reasons I found the Strategy Execution Forum, is to try and get this awareness and pitch to the executive team that you're hemorrhaging value, your profitability, and overall business performance is going to be impacted. And you've got to fund the creation of an enterprise function, strategy execution office, value management office, enterprise PMO, maybe, that's going to be the custodians tasked with developing that strategy execution muscle. Now, that's not an easy thing, right? That's, I said, 10 miles wide, 2 inch deep. There's a lot of things to go, right? But it's going to be a multi-year journey to do that, especially on the discretionary and operational side of things, right? But it is one of the most significant investments an organization should be making.
Absolutely. So let's put some numbers on it, right? So think of that leakage. Okay. So the last PMI data I saw had the percentage of projects that just fail outright. They just don't deliver the business value, was just over 30%. Right. So we'll say it's a third. Okay, that's scary, right? That's pretty significant leakage, to use your metaphor. If that was a machine bottling Coke, and other brands of cola are available. But so you've got a machine, it's bottling Coke, and every third bottle is smashed, right? You would pretty quickly focus on fixing that machine, right? But somehow it's okay for projects to fail at that rate. No, it's not. It's not necessary for them to fail at that rate. But here's the really interesting insight. Right, that number, that third of projects failing, that number really hasn't changed over a 15, 20-year period. Despite the fact that as an industry, right, the strategy execution industry, we spend, depending who you listen to, between $5 and $7 billion a year on PPM tools to stop the leaking. Right, that's why we buy PPM tools, is to stop those projects failing. Empirically, it doesn't seem to work. So what do? You go and you look at the root cause, right? If it was a machine that was breaking, you wouldn't just say, oh, that thing keeps falling off the roof and hitting it, right, and breaking the bottles. You wouldn't just say that. You say, okay, well, why does that thing fall off the roof? And then why does that happen? You do the 5 whys, right? And you go back and you figure out what's the root cause. So when you look at the root cause of a lot of the failure, it comes down to the fact that you're trying to do too many things all at the same time with the same resources. We're back to strategic alignment. Okay, if you're not making that prioritization and resource allocation and actively allocating resources to align with your strategy, but not over allocating your resources, okay, this is crucial, then magically good things happen. I promise you, they do. Go try it, right? Just go tomorrow, go out and just stop a third of your projects. Just stop them. Doesn't matter which third, just stop a third of them and see what happens. And magic will happen, okay? So overloading your people is the best thing you can do if you want to guarantee project failure, okay? But if you'd rather not have project failure, then you need to take this alignment thing seriously. And when people talk about aligning resources with your strategy, part of that statement is not trying to do too much. We're going to align the resources we have, not the resources we wish we had, but the resources we actually have to deliver our strategy and figure out how we can maximize the ROI from those resources. So alignment isn't just which projects should we do, it's how many should we do? Which order should we do them in, right? Because when you answer those questions, you're plugging the holes in the execution factory, right? You're reducing the ways that your projects are going to fail simply by not overloading the team. You still have to manage projects well, and that's where the PPM tools really help you. Right? You have to manage the tools. You need to be able to do governance and reporting, all that kind of good stuff. I'm not saying that's bad. It's not. It's table stakes. You got to do it. But if you don't do this strategic planning, strategic alignment, portfolio management, call it whatever you like, I don't care what you call it. If you don't do that well, you're going to overload your people again, and your projects will keep failing.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, like I said, we talked at the start. There's a lot more is known around failure rates and challenge rates, whatever the stats are, right? Different stats, right? That result in value being lost and value being deferred, right? And that may well be around 30% of value being lost from that existing in-flight portfolio. But as we said earlier, right, there could be another 30% of value that you didn't identify in the first place. I'm calling it the opportunity cost of not even working on the wrong projects in the first place. That goes beyond that 20% completely misaligned to some which are partially misaligned, right?
Right.
So I mean,
the value leaps forward when you do this process correctly, right? When you do it effectively, I should say, right? So first of all, we stop doing stuff that's just a waste, right? That boosts our ROI. Secondly, we're then investing in the project to add more value. So for each unit of investment, we're getting more value. We're boosting our ROI. And then fewer projects are failing. That's boosting our ROI. And because we're managing our resources properly, we're delivering projects faster, which is boosting our ROI. I mean, this is really good, right? So why aren't we all doing it? Why aren't we all obsessing about this? As a senior leader, this should be something that you obsess about, that you don't just say, oh, we had a meeting and we did it. This should be something that you're living and breathing all the time, thinking about, it should be, it should be that cadence, right? It shouldn't be once a year and done. We should be doing it. We should be looking at it with a monthly and a quarterly cadence to make sure that we're, because things change over time. Right, we realize the project's bigger than we thought, or something. But
I think it comes down to what you just said, right? The executives have to understand the impact that this is happening, and take ownership of that. Now, that doesn't mean, the executives are there for a reason to run the business, and they're good at running the business. They need the right operational people, aka the people that are going to staff this enterprise function, strategy execution office, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
That are going to make sure that orchestration happens across the organization, right? And
that's right.
And acknowledge that this is going to take time, but and that's where I want to start with the strategy execution forum. It's getting that acknowledgement there's a problem, and then working with the community to say what are the ways that we need to fix this problem. Now, Stuart, I know we're almost up on time, and I was going to ask you about the evolution, but I don't think we need to go there, right? Because we've just stated that there's a problem and we need to fix this problem. Therefore, that is the evolution of taking this.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. You got it.
So with that, I mean, we've got to do more of these discussions, because I think we could have gone on for much longer. We didn't get beyond some of just the basic aspects of misalignment. But I really appreciate you taking the time today. And
awesome, thank you for having me. And it's a fascinating topic, and as you can tell, I get really excited about it, right? Because it has the opportunity, get this right, and you can transform the performance of your organization. And we've seen it time and again. So really focus on that process, and it can transform not just it can transform your organization and your career and society and all these other good things that come from that. So go do it. Just go do it.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Ben.